the American education system, in particular, standardized testing, and my huge hatred of how the United States does standardized testing. Now, uh, if you're not American, let me tell you about how the United States does standardized testing, in particular for the college level. Well, in particular for those who are going to college, I should say. If you're American, and a lot of you watching this who are American have experienced this, when you're finishing high school, you're at that crucial point where your high school is probably telling you that after you finish these years of high school, you are going to go out. You're gonna graduate. You're gonna get your high school diploma and your cap and gown and all that. Celebrate, blah blah blah, and then you're off on the crossroads. That is, what will you do afterwards? Will you go straight into the workforce? Will you go into a trade, or will you go to college? So, a lot of us pick one of those three different paths. I chose the path of going to college. Now, when I was trying to get to college, I obviously needed to make sure that I had a couple of things satisfied. First off, I had to have good grades, because historically, you're always told you need to have good grades, because if you want to get into college, you need to make sure that you have good grades. I, made sure of that when I finished high school. I graduated with almost a 4.0 GPA. Then, as time passed by in high school, they tell you, well, your grades are not enough. You also got to make sure that you do well on these standardized tests. Now, these standardized tests being the SAT and the ACT. Now, in regards to my hatred of standardized testing in the United States, these two tests in particular are my targets. I've taken both of them, and I've bombed both of them. So, remember, I mentioned before, high GPA, low standardized test scores. That was a bit of a bitch to deal with when I was trying to get into college, because when I was applying to colleges in my own state, colleges in my own state said no, and most likely on the grounds of my test scores, because my GPA was phenomenal for them, but not my test scores. So after I had failed to get into college in my own state, I was at a crossroads of another crossroads of where I would go to after finishing high school. It was either go to the military, which I genuinely didn't want to go into the military. I was not going to serve in a military that was run by either that was going to be run by either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. I hate both of them equally. So with that, I said to myself, well, let's take a chance on going out of state. So I applied out of state, and I was fortunate to get into a college out of state, all the way up in the meme land of Ohio, the University of Toledo. Fantastic college, by the way. I recommend it. Not just because it's my alma mater, but also because that is a college with an amazing bunch of different programs, great sports teams as well. Just a fantastic college. I highly recommend it if you're looking for a college to go to. Even if you've never been to Ohio, like in my case, it's a college that will give you a place for yourself and will allow you to get an education that you've been needing. So, going back to what I mentioned before about standardized tests and how I bombed the SAT and ACT. When I took these tests, I remember that the tests are issued in high schools within your area. And my high school was where I took the SAT. When I went to go take the ACT, I had to take it in another high school because my high school wasn't doing the SAT. And you have to go in on a Saturday morning. So as a high schooler, you're not too excited losing your Saturday morning to go to school to take this lousy test. So as I was taking the test, both tests, I realized that a lot of what the tests were asking me were things that I didn't study in school. Some of them were things that I learned in school, Other things were things that I didn't learn in school at all. Almost as if the tests were just designed to to sort of ask broad questions on these specific topics, and the student may or may not have learned those things in school, based on what state they're in. Which also brings me to the fact that the United States has one of the most idiotic education systems I've seen in the developed world. Instead of allowing a federal system where all states have the same exact educational standards and all students across all 50 states are learning the same exact thing, so a student in California is learning the same thing that a student in New York is learning, we don't do that. No. Because we're the United States. And apparently, states' rights or whatever bullshit. And we have to allow all 50 states to have their own educational standards. So if you live in California, your quality of education is going to differ significantly from a student who is going to school in Mississippi or Alabama or Arkansas or any of these states. And I use those states in particular because those are states that are not very well known for having a high educational standard. So with that being said, when education is handled like this and you are issuing a standardized test that is vital for a student to be able to get into college in this country, but the problem is that you're going to be testing them on things that they may or may not have learned because you're assuming that the test was being issued to somebody in God knows what part of the country. Now, as time had gone by, I had realized more that the SAT and ACT, it wasn't really that they were testing you on things that you didn't learn at all. Which, well, yeah, that was the case, but one thing that's very interesting about these tests is that as you're signing up for the tests, the websites for these private organizations, 'cause that's another thing, I don't know why on earth here in the United States we allow private companies to issue standardized tests that are necessary for you to take in order for you to get into college while you're applying, because colleges are going to ask you for these things. I don't know why private companies are allowed to issue these types of important exams, but that's beside the point. As you're taking these tests, you come to realize that when you're applying for them, when you're filling out the whole application and handing in the fee, because of course you got to pay for these to take these tests. They're not free, you know. They of course, because they're handled by private companies, they gotta milk you somehow. So you pay your fee to take the SAT or the ACT. You take this exam, and as you've applied to take it, they're offering you study material. Of course, you gotta pay extra for the study material. It ain't free, and the study material is confined to this specific test that you're taking for this specific year, because of course these standardized tests get changed every year. And the claim is always that, well, you know, we can't keep testing people on the same thing because that would encourage cheating and all that. Not specifically that. I've come to realize more that it's not that people are gonna cheat on the test. It's more like if you change the test constantly, that means you have to change the study material, which means if you're someone who is not going to buy the study material because either, you know, you said to yourself, well, I'm pretty good at my schoolwork, you know, I'm a student who's applied themselves, I don't think I'm going to need study material for this test if it's supposed to be testing me, as I foolishly assume, on what I went to school for. Or you're on the other end of student who comes from a household that can't afford to buy the study materials, because the study materials were not cheap, and I'm assuming they're still probably not cheap. So when you're trying to get the study materials for this test, the study materials for the SAT and ACT don't actually teach you anything regarding the materials that are contained within the test. They're trying to make you study how to take the test, which is far different from studying, you know, material that you need to be able to pass the test. You're studying material that is needed in order for you to pass this specific test, and this specific test only. And if you got these study materials, if you got these study materials, you bought these study materials, you learned from these study materials how to take these tests, and you did well on the test, as opposed to somebody who didn't have any of these study materials, such as, you know, in my case, you know, because like I said, I didn't need, you know, I felt like I didn't need the study materials because, again, If I went to school and I know that my GPA and my grades were good, and these tests are supposed to be teaching you, and these tests are supposed to be testing you, my apologies, supposed to be testing you on things that you actually, studied in school, then why in the hell would I need, a study guide for it? If I'm supposed to at least study these materials and I'll go to take this test and I'll do well, right? No, because I didn't study the material for this specific test, in the way that this specific test handles the material. Because again, you're studying with the SAT and ACT prep materials. You're studying you're studying to take this specific test. You're not studying the materials that you need to know that are going to be on. Basically, you're not learning the subjects. You're only learning the test itself. You're learning how to take this test. You're not learning anything regarding math or science or reading or writing, nothing like that. You're just learning, how do I quickly understand these things for this specific test that I'm going to take. After I take this test, regardless of how I do, that's it. I gotta dust off my hands, gotta clean them off, and done. This study material that was spent, that money was spent on, is completely worthless now, because the test itself, it was only good for this one test, because now the test material is going to change the following year. And if you're studying this year's material for the following year's test, you're going to be shit out of luck, because everything has changed and the way the test is organized and structured has changed as well. And this is primarily meant to make sure that you are not using old study material for future tests, so that way you can't simply, avoid having to pay all the fees to get all the fancy materials and stuff that you need to take these idiotic standardized tests. I don't understand why, as an American, why on earth we don't have something like entrance exams to get into colleges. Why on earth are we relying on standardized tests issued by private companies, across all 50 states, where education varies on a state-by-state basis, instead of having college entrance exams where if you're applying to go to a specific college, just take this entrance exam, see if you did well on it. If you did well, congratulations, you'll get in. If you didn't do well on it, well, tough tits, go somewhere else. But at least you know that the college is trying to test you on material that, at least based on each individual state, is the standard of what you should have been learning in school. You go to college, you apply to that college, they test you on what it's assumed that you learned in school based on the state that you're in, and depending on what you scored, boom, you either pass or you fail. You get in or you don't get in. But leaving it to a test so badly done, so badly organized, so run in such a way to make max profits, because again, private company, being handled to make max profits instead of actually making sure that it tests students on what they learned, in my opinion, is detrimental to the education system of this country. And I have a lot of issues with the American education system. It's one of the reasons why, as an American, I never understood when we have foreign students from countries like the UK, because when I went to college, I had classmates who were from places like the UK or Japan or Germany or France, any of these different countries, that are in the developed world with their own educational standards. A lot of them come here to the United States and they tell themselves, well, getting an education from an American college is seen as a big deal overseas. Which, as an American, I've never understood that mindset. Like, I'm not saying that our colleges are horrible, and I'm not saying that my college was bad. What I'm saying is that how on earth are you going to say that getting a college education from, I don't know, some random college in bumfuck middle of nowhere like Arkansas or Kentucky or something, not the universities of Arkansas and Kentucky, I'm talking about just some random obscure college from the middle of nowhere in these states, how on earth is that better than getting an education from one of the colleges in your own country? Because your own country, I'm assuming, has to have infinitely better educational standards than the U.S. education system. At least they don't have these god-awful standardized test practices that we have here. So again, it's one of those things that blows my mind. But in regards to one thing that I've always argued would be very good for improving our own education system, would be removing these idiotic standardized tests like the SAT and ACT, and instead establishing some kind of entrance exams for these colleges, or hell, doing what I've always argued we should do, eliminating the whole states control their education system that we use here, and instead put it in the hands of the federal government and have all 50 states learn the same damn thing instead of saying, oh, well, this state learns this and this state learns this. No, it makes no sense from any logical standpoint. Why in the hell would you prefer to have one state get a better education than another state? Why can't it just be all states learn the same damn thing? So that way when one high schooler in Mississippi graduates and a high schooler in Minnesota graduates, that way they both know the same things going out of school. But no, as is typical, you know, the way the United States handles something as simple as education is handled poorly. And that's why our educational standards have not been doing so well, especially these days. But yeah, I've always argued that standardized testing here in the United States does not do a good job of testing you on anything. It's not a good way of measuring a student's, you know, abilities going into college. And in my opinion, tests like the SAT and ACT should be completely removed from the equation. They should just be completely removed out of our society, out of our education system, and replaced with something that actually does test you on your knowledge and what you know and don't know how to do. Because the way it is right now is just a joke. And it absolutely pisses me off that we still keep this idiotic, you know, useless system. And honestly, if we were to get rid of this system, it would do so much more wonders for students who, you know, may not have come from very well-off backgrounds, but, you know, were students who were gifted, smart, or have applied themselves, or students who maybe did come from somewhere well-off, but again, these students, if they're doing well in school and they didn't, and they basically felt to themselves, you know, I don't need the study materials. Like in my own case, if I'm doing well in school, why the hell would I need study materials for this exam? You know, I don't need it. And if it's supposed to be a test that tests you on what you learned in school, then I don't know why I need study materials for it. If I've learned all the stuff that I learned and I'm gonna apply it to this test, well, you know, now if you test the students on something that actually is what they learned in school, they would actually be able to at least have a higher score. They would be doing well, instead of this convoluted bullshit that we have now with the SAT and ACT. Anyway, that's my personal gripe on these joke tests, and why on earth America shouldn't be using them anymore, or why colleges in this country shouldn't be using them anymore at all. It doesn't really do anything of value or benefit for anyone, and it screws over more people than it actually helps. Anyways, that was a little ramble and rant from yours truly about the American education system and standardized tests. I'd like to thank y'all for sitting through this rant, and I will see y'all next time. Peace.